A crystal glass shattered across a $12,000 tuxedo in front of Chicago's most powerful elite, and the woman who spilled it just signed her death warrant, or so everyone thought. But when Damian Moretti, the city's most feared mafia king, publicly humiliated the quiet stranger in the black dress, he made the deadliest mistake of his criminal career. Because the trembling woman he called trash wasn't powerless at all. She was the granddaughter of Alessandro De Luca, the East Coast crime lord who once erased an entire syndicate for a lesser insult. Now, with snipers hidden across Chicago and a reckoning decades in the making, the man who ruled through fear is about to learn what true power really looks like. Drop a like and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. You won't believe where this goes. The Langham Hotel's grand ballroom glittered like a jewelry box designed by someone with too much money and not enough taste. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars hung from gilded ceilings. White marble floors reflected the glow of 1,000 candles arranged on tables draped in silk that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Chicago's elite moved through the space like expensive ghosts. Senators in tailored suits, tech billionaires in experimental designer wear, old money society wives dripping in diamonds they inherited from grandmothers who'd never worked a day in their lives. The annual Blackstone Charity Gala, where the powerful pretended to care about the powerless for exactly 4 hours before returning to their penthouses and private islands. Damian Moretti stood near the bar, a crystal tumbler of 30-year Macallan in his hand, watching the room with the detached interest of an apex predator observing prey that wasn't worth the energy to hunt. At 32, he looked like violence wrapped in Italian tailoring, 6'3" of lean muscle poured into a custom midnight black tuxedo that probably cost more than a decent used car. Dark hair swept back from a face that would have been handsome if not for the coldness in his gray eyes. Eyes that had watched men beg before ordering their executions. Eyes that calculated profit margins in human suffering. Publicly, Damian Moretti was the CEO of Moretti Global Shipping, a legitimate logistics empire that moved container ships across the Great Lakes and beyond. Privately, he was the king of Chicago's underworld, the youngest don in the city's history, controller of ports, distribution networks, protection rackets, and enough political influence to make aldermen sweat through their shirts when his name appeared on their phones. The Moretti family didn't deal in street-level garbage. No prostitution, no drugs on school corners. They dealt in wholesale. Industrial-scale smuggling, weapons, untraceable money laundering through shipping invoices that existed in triplicate across 3 countries, clean violence, corporate brutality, and everyone in this ballroom knew it. That was why the mayor's chief of staff had personally escorted Damian to the VIP section, why the senior senator from Illinois had practically genuflected when shaking his hand, why the CEO of a Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company had nervously laughed at Damian's completely humorless observation about supply chain efficiency. Power recognized power. And in Chicago, Damian Moretti was power. "You're brooding again," said a voice to his left. Roman Kane appeared beside him, a tumbler of bourbon in one hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a 1940s noir film. Damian's consigliere was 45, gray creeping through black hair, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy right up until he was crushing your windpipe. Roman had been with Damian's father before the old man's heart gave out during a negotiation that went badly. Now Roman served as Damian's strategic mind, his historical memory, his early warning system, his only friend, if Damian was being honest, which he rarely was. "I'm not brooding," Damian said. "I'm observing. You're doing that thing where you mentally catalog everyone's net worth and criminal liability." Roman sipped his drink. "It's your tell. We're surrounded by thieves and cowards spending stolen money on tax-deductible champagne," Damian replied. "Someone should keep score," Roman snorted. "Spoken like a man who just donated $500,000 to the Children's Hospital while simultaneously running $60 million in untaxed pharmaceuticals through your shipping lines. I contain multitudes. You contain sociopathic tendencies and an Italian temper." Damian almost smiled. Almost. The ballroom continued its elaborate dance of wealth and influence. A string quartet played something classical that Damian vaguely recognized from his mother's obsession with opera before she'd died. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that looked like abstract art. Politicians pressed flesh. Donors compared vacation homes. Somewhere in the crowd, a federal prosecutor who'd tried and failed to indict Damien 3 times was probably getting drunk on wine he couldn't afford, while his wife glared at him for ruining her social standing. That's when Damien saw her, or rather, didn't see her. A woman in a simple black satin gown, completely out of place among the couture and custom designs surrounding her. She moved along the periphery of the crowd like someone trying not to be noticed. Mid-20s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back in a simple style. No jewelry except small pearl earrings. The dress was elegant, but off the rack. Damien could tell from the way it fit. Not poorly, but not with the precision of tailoring that cost 4 figures. She looked terrified and utterly invisible. Exactly the kind of person who didn't belong at an event where entry required either a $50,000 donation or an invitation from someone who mattered. Damien watched her navigate the crowd, holding a champagne flute she wasn't drinking from, eyes down, posture screaming, "Please don't notice me." Some assistant, probably. A +1 brought by someone important who'd already abandoned her to go network, or maybe a non-profit worker required to attend as part of grant compliance. He dismissed her from his thoughts entirely. That was his first mistake. Moretti? Alderman Gary Breslin materialized from the crowd like a summoned demon, red-faced and sweating despite the ballroom's perfect climate control. Breslin was 60 pounds overweight, balding, and perpetually looked like a man having a heart attack in slow motion. He also controlled zoning permissions across 3 Southside districts that Damien needed for a new distribution facility. "Alderman," Damien said with the warmth of someone greeting a parking meter. "I've been meaning to call," Breslin said, too loud, gesturing with a champagne flute that was definitely not his first. "About that property development we discussed." Damien's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold. They hadn't discussed anything. Damien had told Breslin what was going to happen, and Breslin had nodded because men like Breslin always nodded when men like Damien spoke. "This isn't the venue," Damien said quietly. Right, of course." Breslin leaned in, breath reeking of alcohol and desperation. "I just wanted to say the approval process might take a bit longer than expected. There's been some community pushback, environmental concerns." "Concerns that will be addressed," Damien interrupted, voice dropping to a register that made Breslin's smile falter. Quickly. "Absolutely. I just thought given the complexity, perhaps we could discuss additional consultation fees." Damien set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray with enough force to make crystal ring. "Breslin," he said softly, "are you attempting to renegotiate terms we've already agreed upon?" The alderman's face went from red to pale in record time. No, of course not. I'm just saying—" "You're saying you'd like to reconsider our arrangement." Damien smiled without warmth. "Which means you'd like to reconsider whether your daughter continues her graduate program at Northwestern without her boyfriend's gambling debts becoming a federal investigation." Breslin looked like he'd been slapped. "You're a smart man," Damien continued, voice still quiet, still deadly. "Smart enough to recognize when a conversation is over." The alderman nodded jerkily, muttered something that might have been agreement or a prayer, and disappeared back into the crowd like fog burning off under sunlight. Roman appeared at Damien's elbow again. "You're making friends everywhere tonight." "Breslin's an opportunistic parasite who thinks I won't notice him trying to squeeze an extra payday out of a done deal," Damien replied. "I notice everything. Your humility is inspiring." Damien was about to respond when a commotion near the bar caught his attention. A drunk socialite, Victoria Ashford, if Damien remembered correctly, wife of some hedge fund administrator, was gesturing wildly while telling a story, champagne sloshing in her glass. She turned suddenly, her elbow connecting with someone behind her, the woman in the black dress, the simple one, the invisible one. The collision sent the woman stumbling forward directly into Damien's path. She crashed into him hard enough that her champagne flute went flying. But worse, far worse, was the full glass of 30-year Macallan in Damien's hand. Crystal shattered against marble. Amber liquid exploded across Damien's chest, soaking through his custom tuxedo jacket, his shirt, spreading dark and wet across fabric that cost more than some people earned in a month. The ballroom froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. The string quartet faltered. Even the waiters stopped moving. Everyone turned to look at the spectacle of Damian Moretti, the most dangerous man in Chicago, standing soaked in whiskey while a trembling woman in a cheap dress stammered apologies at his feet. Damian looked down at his ruined tuxedo, felt the cold liquid seeping through expensive fabric against his skin, saw the woman staring up at him with wide, terrified eyes, and something ugly uncoiled in his chest. Not rage, exactly. Rage would have been cleaner. This was cold, calculated. The cruelty of a man who'd built an empire on the understanding that weakness existed to be exploited and humiliation was a tool like any other. The woman was already apologizing, words tumbling out in a panic. "I'm so sorry, I didn't. She pushed me, I wasn't. Please, I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the cleaning, You'll pay for cleaning?" Damian interrupted, voice carrying across the silent ballroom. She froze. "This tuxedo," Damian continued, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "was custom made in Milan, $12,000. The shirt? Another $800. And the whiskey you just destroyed?" He smiled without humor. "That glass alone was worth more than whatever you paid for that dress you're wearing." Nervous laughter rippled through the nearby crowd. The woman's face went white. "I'll pay," she whispered. "I swear, I'll find a way." "With what?" Damian's voice dripped contempt. "You're clearly here as someone's charity case. Look at you. That dress is off the rack. Those shoes are scuffed. You don't belong here any more than a stray dog belongs at a dinner table." Gasps now. Actual gasps. But Damian couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. Because something about this woman's fear, her humiliation, her complete powerlessness in front of Chicago's elite, it fed something dark in him. Proved what he'd always known, that the world was divided into predators and prey. And he was apex. "What's your name?" he demanded. "Celine," she whispered, eyes on the floor. "Celine Valcourt." "Well, Celine Valcourt," Damian gestured to the ruined tuxedo. "You've just proven that some people should know their place. You came to an event you couldn't afford, wearing clothes that embarrass you, and now you've physically assaulted one of the hosts." "It was an accident. Accidents have consequences." Damian turned to the nearest security guard, a thick-necked man in a black suit who'd gone very still. "Escort Miss Valcourt out of the venue. Make sure everyone sees." "No," the woman, Celine, said quietly. "Please." "You want to stay?" Damian's smile widened. "After making a spectacle of yourself? After proving you don't have the grace or composure to exist among civilized people?" He leaned down, close enough that she probably could smell the whiskey on his ruined clothes, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "You're trash," he said softly, "and trash belongs on the street." He straightened, nodded to security. 2 guards moved forward to take her arms. That's when everything changed. The trembling stopped. Celine Valcourt's posture straightened. The fear drained from her eyes like someone flipping a switch. When she looked up at Damian again, he saw something that sent ice down his spine despite the warmth of the ballroom. Control. Absolute terrifying control. She didn't pull away from the guards, didn't fight. Instead, she stepped forward, one precise step that brought her close enough to Damian that the guards hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. When she spoke, her voice was different. Still quiet, but with an edge that could cut steel. "You mistake silence for weakness, Mr. Moretti." Damian blinked. "Men like you," she continued, each word precisely placed, "spend your entire lives confusing fear with respect. You think cruelty makes you powerful. You think humiliation proves dominance." She tilted her head slightly, and her dark eyes seemed to look straight through him. "You never realize you're standing in gasoline until someone lights the match." The ballroom had gone so quiet, Damian could hear his own heartbeat. "Is that a threat?" he asked, voice low. Celine smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone afraid. It was the smile of someone who'd just decided something important. "No, Mr. Moretti," she said softly. "It's a prophecy." Then she turned to the guards, nodded once, and let them escort her toward the exit. But she didn't walk like someone being removed. She walked like royalty leaving a throne room that had disappointed her. The crowd parted for her. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. And Damian stood there, whiskey drying on his ruined tuxedo, watching her disappear through the gilded doors while something cold and unfamiliar crawled up his spine. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Damien Moretti felt uncertain. Roman appeared at his elbow, face unreadable. That, his consigliere said quietly, was interesting. Damien didn't respond, couldn't respond, because something about the way that woman had looked at him, like he was an insect she'd decided wasn't worth stepping on, had shaken something loose in his understanding of the world. The gala continued around him. Conversations resumed. The quartet started playing again. Victoria Ashford was already drunkenly apologizing to someone else, the incident apparently forgotten by everyone except Damien. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just changed, that he'd made a mistake far worse than ruining a tuxedo. "Find out who she is," Damien said to Roman, voice rough. "Celine Valcourt. I want to know everything. Who she knows, who she works for, why she was here." Roman's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "You really want to dig into this?" "She threatened me," Damien replied, "in front of Chicago's most powerful people. I don't let threats go unanswered." "That wasn't a threat," Roman said carefully. "That was a warning." "Same thing." "No," Roman replied, already pulling out his phone. "It's really not." But he made the call anyway, because that's what consigliere did. 3 hours later, when the gala finally wound down and Damien returned to his penthouse office overlooking Lake Michigan, Roman appeared with a tablet and an expression Damien had never seen before. Fear, actual, genuine fear, on the face of a man who'd helped dispose of bodies. "Tell me," Damien commanded. Roman set the tablet down on the desk, and Damien saw a photograph of Celine Valcourt, except the caption beneath it read differently: Celine DeLuca. "DeLuca?" Damien frowned. "That doesn't mean—" "She's Alessandro DeLuca's granddaughter," Roman interrupted. "His only grandchild, daughter of his deceased son, Marco." The name hit Damien like a fist to the chest. Alessandro DeLuca. The ghost of the East Coast. The single most feared crime patriarch in the United States. A man whose empire stretched from New York to Miami, controlling ports that made Damien's shipping operation look like a lemonade stand. A man who'd allegedly ordered the execution of an entire rival family, 17 people, because someone had disrespected his wife at an opera. A man whose name was spoken in whispers even among made men, because Alessandro DeLuca didn't believe in forgiveness. He believed in examples. "No," Damien said, "that's impossible. DeLuca's son died 15 years ago in a car accident. There was no mention of—" "He sent her away," Roman interrupted, reading from the tablet. "After Marco died. Sent her to boarding schools in Europe, kept her completely out of the life. She's been in Chicago for 2 years, works at an independent bookstore in Wicker Park, lives alone. No security detail that our people can identify." "Then she's not—" "She's his heir," Roman said flatly. "The only direct DeLuca blood left. And you just publicly humiliated her in front of 500 witnesses." Damien sat down slowly. "Alessandro DeLuca has ended syndicates over smaller insults," Roman continued. 3 years ago, a Baltimore crew made a joke about his age. They found 8 bodies in a shipping container 2 weeks later. Months. "She didn't identify herself," Damien said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. "How was I supposed to know?" "It doesn't matter," Roman replied. "You humiliated a DeLuca. You called her trash. You had her physically removed from a public event." He paused. "If Alessandro decides to respond, we're not talking about a turf war. We're talking about systematic dismantling of everything you've built." Damien's mind raced through calculations, through possibilities, through the architecture of alliances and vulnerabilities that made up his empire, and came to a single, unavoidable conclusion. He was exposed. Completely, catastrophically exposed. "Get me a meeting with her," Damien said. "Tomorrow." "Damien." "Now, Roman." His consigliere nodded and left without another word. Damien sat alone in his office, Chicago's lights spreading out beneath him like a kingdom he'd spent a decade building, and realized for the first time that kingdoms could burn. All it took was one match, and he'd just handed it to the granddaughter of the most dangerous man in America. Damien didn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse office watching dawn break over Lake Michigan, turning the water from black to gray to pale gold, and tried to figure out how badly he'd just destroyed himself. The whiskey-stained tuxedo lay crumpled in the corner where he'd thrown it 4 hours ago. His shirt was unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with tension that hadn't released since Roman had shown him that photograph. Celine DeLuca, not Valcourt, DeLuca, the granddaughter of a man who'd allegedly had a New Jersey state senator's entire family erased because the senator voted against a port expansion bill. A man whose name made experienced killers go quiet. A man who'd built an empire so vast and so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of the East Coast that federal prosecutors had given up trying to indict him 15 years ago, and Damien had called his only heir trash, in front of 500 witnesses. His phone buzzed. Roman. Talk, Damien said. I found her. Roman's voice sounded like he'd been awake all night, too. She's at the bookstore. Opens at 9. I can have a car there in 20 minutes if you want to. I'll go myself. Silence on the line. That's a bad idea, Roman finally said. All my ideas right now are bad ideas, Damien replied. At least this one doesn't involve waiting for Alessandro DeLuca to decide whether to kill me. You don't know that he's even aware of what happened. Roman. Damien closed his eyes. A man like that knows when someone spits on the sidewalk in his territory. You think he doesn't know his granddaughter got humiliated at a public event? More silence. Send 2 cars, Roman said. Armed. I don't care if she looks like a bookstore clerk. She's DeLuca blood. You don't walk into that situation exposed. Fine. Damien ended the call and stood, his body aching like he'd been in a fight. Maybe he had been. Maybe the fight just hadn't started yet. He showered, dressed in charcoal slacks and a black sweater, deliberately casual, deliberately not the armor of a business suit, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage where 2 black SUVs were already idling. 4 men total, all ex-military, all carrying concealed. Damien climbed into the back of the lead vehicle without speaking. The drive to Wicker Park took 30 minutes through Saturday morning traffic. Damien watched Chicago slide past the tinted windows, the gleaming downtown towers giving way to converted warehouses and boutique coffee shops, the architecture of new money trying desperately to look authentic. Wicker Park had gentrified hard over the past decade, turning from working-class Polish neighborhood to hipster paradise, but pockets of the old world still existed in the margins, including apparently an independent bookstore called The Turning Page. The SUVs pulled up across the street from a narrow brick building wedged between a vintage clothing store and an overpriced juice bar. The bookstore's window display showed stacks of used hardcovers and a hand-lettered sign advertising a poetry reading next Thursday. The kind of place that probably smelled like old paper and coffee and barely made rent. Completely unremarkable, except for the woman visible through the glass front door, unlocking it from the inside. Celine. She wore jeans and an oversized cream-colored sweater that made her look even smaller than she had at the gala. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup that Damien could see. She looked like a graduate student or a barista, not the heir to a criminal empire that controlled half the eastern seaboard. Damien climbed out of the SUV. Stay here, he told his security, but keep the engines running. The head of his detail, a former Marine named Costa, gave him a look that said this was stupid, and they both knew it, but nodded anyway. Damien crossed the street and pushed open the bookstore door. A small bell chimed. Celine looked up from behind the counter where she'd been sorting through a stack of invoices. Her expression didn't change when she saw him. No surprise, no fear, no anger, just a flat, evaluating stare that made Damien feel like an insect under glass. We're not open yet, she said. Her voice was different from last night. No trembling, no desperation, just factual and cold. Damien closed the door behind him, heard the lock click. I came to apologize, he said. Celine set down the invoices with precise, deliberate movements. No, you didn't. Excuse me? You came to apologize because you found out who I am. She tilted her head slightly, and Damien saw the same terrifying composure he'd glimpsed last night when she'd warned him about standing in gasoline. You came because you're afraid, not because you're sorry. Damien opened his mouth to argue and realized he had no defense. She was absolutely right. Does that distinction matter? He asked instead. To you? Probably not. Celine moved out from behind the counter, and Damien noticed she walked differently here. No nervousness, no hesitation. This was her territory. To me, it's everything. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that Damien could see the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept either, and the small scar on her left eyebrow that he'd missed last night. "When you thought I was nobody," she continued, voice still quiet but sharp as broken glass, "you treated me like garbage. You humiliated me. You called me trash in front of hundreds of people and had me physically removed like I was diseased." She paused. "That is who you are when you think there won't be consequences." "I was angry. You were cruel." Celine's eyes didn't blink. "There's a difference. Anger is hot and fast. What you did was cold and calculated. You enjoyed it." Damien felt something twist in his chest because she was right about that too. He had enjoyed it. The power. The control. The way the crowd had laughed nervously and the woman had trembled and he'd stood there soaked in whiskey, feeling like a king proving his dominance. It made him sick now, looking at it clearly. "You're right," he said. Celine blinked. First sign of surprise. "I was cruel," Damien continued, the words tasting like ash. "I humiliated you because I could. Because it made me feel powerful. Because I've built an empire on the understanding that weakness exists to be exploited." He met her eyes. "And I was wrong." For several seconds, Celine just stared at him. Then she laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter and tired, and somehow worse than if she'd screamed at him. "You were wrong," she repeated. "Just like that. You discovered I'm Alessandro De Luca's granddaughter, and suddenly you're capable of moral reflection." She shook her head. "Do you understand how pathetic that is? How completely that proves everything I said about you?" "Yes," Damien said simply. That seemed to surprise her again. "I'm a sociopath with an Italian temper who spent a decade building an empire on violence and fear," Damien continued. "I don't apologize. I don't admit fault. I don't lose sleep over the people I've hurt." He paused. "But I also don't make strategic mistakes. And what I did last night was the biggest strategic mistake of my life. So this is still just business to you." Celine's voice had gone flat again. "Damage control." "No." Damien surprised himself with how much he meant it. "It's also shame." Celine's expression flickered, something almost like respect passing across her features before disappearing. "Shame doesn't absolve you," she said. "I know. And apologizing doesn't erase what you did. I know that too." Celine studied him for a long moment, and Damien had the uncomfortable feeling of being dissected by someone who saw through every lie he'd ever told himself. "My grandfather," she finally said, "arrived in Chicago last night." Damien's blood went cold. "He's staying at the Peninsula," Celine continued, voice still conversational. "Presidential suite, 26 men with him. Some are staying at other hotels throughout the city. Others are in rental properties my family owns but officially has no connection to." She paused. "He's been planning this visit for 3 weeks. Since the gala was announced, and I told him I'd been invited." "You told him?" Damien's voice came out strangled. "Of course I told him." Celine's smile was sad and terrible. "I tell him everything. I'm his only family, the last piece of his son." She looked at Damien with something that might have been pity. "Did you think I was hiding? Did you think I was trying to escape the life?" "You work in a bookstore," Damien said weakly. "Because I like books," Celine replied. "And because my grandfather wanted me to have something normal, something mine. He spent my whole childhood trying to protect me from what he is, from what our family does." Her expression hardened. "And then you confirmed every fear he's ever had about letting me exist in the world without armed guards." Damien felt the floor tilting beneath him. "He's going to kill me," he said. "Maybe." Celine walked back behind the counter, picked up her invoices. "He hasn't decided yet." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," she said without looking up, "that you have until tonight to prove you're worth the oxygen you're consuming. My grandfather wants to meet you. 6 o'clock, the Peninsula, presidential suite." She finally met his eyes. "Come alone or don't come at all." "That's a death trap." "Probably." Celine went back to sorting invoices. "But it's also the only chance you have of surviving the next 72 hours. Your choice." Damien stood there, mind racing through scenarios, through possibilities, through the architecture of every escape route he'd ever built, and came to the same conclusion he'd reached at 4 in the morning. There were no escape routes, not from Alessandro De Luca. "I'll be there," he said. Selina nodded like she'd expected nothing else. Damien turned to leave, got as far as the door before her voice stopped him. "Mr. Moretti." He looked back. Selina was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "When you called me trash," she said quietly, "you revealed who you really are underneath the expensive suits and the corporate reputation. My grandfather saw the video. Every major news outlet had cameras there. It's already on social media." She paused. "You didn't just humiliate me. You humiliated yourself. You proved that money and power haven't made you civilized. They've just made you dangerous." Damien had no response to that. He left the bookstore and crossed back to where his security detail waited, their faces carefully neutral. "Take me back to the office," he told Costa. "Then I want you to find out everything about the De Luca organization's current presence in Chicago. Locations, personnel, capabilities. I want to know exactly how many men Alessandro brought with him and where they're positioned." Costa nodded and pulled out his phone. The drive back downtown felt longer than the drive out. Damien stared at Chicago, passing by the windows, and tried to process the impossible situation he'd landed himself in. Alessandro De Luca, the ghost of the East Coast, the most feared crime lord in America, was in his city with 26 armed men, and Damien had been summoned to a meeting that would almost certainly end with his execution. Unless he could somehow convince a legendary old-world Don that the man who'd publicly humiliated his only granddaughter deserved to live. No pressure. Back at his office, Damien found Roman waiting with a laptop and an expression that suggested the news wasn't good. "Tell me," Damien said, pouring himself a whiskey he didn't want but needed anyway. Roman turned the laptop around. Dim. The screen showed a social media video, already at 2 million views, of Damien standing in his ruined tuxedo calling Celine Valcourt trash while she trembled in front of him. The comments section was a nightmare, half calling Damien a bully and an elitist monster, half making jokes about karma and powerful men getting what they deserved. "It's everywhere," Roman said. "Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. The Chicago Tribune is running a think piece about wealth inequality and public humiliation. 3 city council members have released statements condemning your behavior." He paused. "The mayor's office called. They want to distance themselves from your charitable contributions." Damien drained the whiskey. "It gets worse," Roman continued. "Our distribution partners in Gary are asking questions. The Longshoremen's union rep called to say they're concerned about our public image affecting contract negotiations. And 2 of our shell corporations just had their accounts frozen pending audit by the Illinois Department of Revenue." "That's Alessandro," Damien said immediately. "He's applying pressure through channels we can't directly trace back to him." "Agreed." Roman closed the laptop. "He's demonstrating that he can dismantle your operation without firing a shot. The question is whether he's doing that as a warning or as foreplay before killing you." "He wants to meet," Damien said. "Tonight, 6 o'clock, the Peninsula." Roman went very still. "That's a trap, I know." "You can't actually be considering—" "I don't have a choice," Damien interrupted. "If I don't go, he'll interpret that as cowardice or disrespect. Either way, he escalates. If I do go, at least I have a chance to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" Roman demanded. "You humiliated his granddaughter on camera in front of Chicago's elite. There's no negotiation that fixes that. There's just how quickly he decides to kill you." Damien set down his glass. "Then I guess I'd better figure out how to make that process as slow as possible." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and contingency planning. Damien contacted every ally he had, called in favors from politicians and business partners, tried to build a coalition of support that might give Alessandro De Luca pause before starting a war. It was useless. Everyone knew who Alessandro De Luca was. Everyone had heard the stories, and nobody, not the aldermen Damien had in his pocket, not the judges he'd paid off, not even the federal prosecutor who owed him for burying evidence in a corruption case, wanted to position themselves between Damien and the ghost of the East Coast. By 5 o'clock, Damien was alone. Truly, completely alone, in a way he hadn't been since he'd taken over his father's empire. Roman drove him to the Peninsula personally, the 2 of them sitting in silence as Chicago's evening traffic crawled past the windows. The hotel rose up ahead of them, sleek and modern and expensive, The kind of place where presidents stayed and celebrities got married and crime lords apparently conducted business. "I'll wait in the lobby," Roman said as they pulled up to the entrance. "If you're not out in 2 hours, I'm calling everyone. Police, FBI, everyone." "Don't," Damien replied. "If I'm not out in 2 hours, I'm already dead. Calling the authorities just makes you a target too." "Damien, I mean it, Roman." Damien met his consigliere's eyes. "If this goes bad, you get out. Take the contingency funds and disappear. Don't try to avenge me. Don't try to hold the territory. Just run." Roman's jaw worked like he wanted to argue, but finally he just nodded. Damien climbed out of the car and walked into the peninsula's gleaming lobby. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the kind of understated luxury that costs more than most people's houses. A few guests milled around, businessmen in suits and tourists in expensive casual wear. And standing near the elevators, 2 men in dark clothes who watched Damien with the flat professional stare of experienced killers. DeLuca's security. Damien approached them without hesitating. Showing fear now would be worse than useless. "I'm here to see Alessandro," he said. The taller of the 2 men, mid-40s, scar tissue around his knuckles, nodded once and gestured toward the elevator. No words, no unnecessary communication. They rode up in silence. The elevator was mirrored on all sides, and Damien caught his own reflection, pale, tense, looking every one of his 32 years and then some. He looked like a man going to his own execution, because he probably was. The elevator opened onto the top floor. The guards led him down a carpeted hallway to a set of double doors at the end. One of them knocked twice, a specific pattern that was probably a code, and the doors opened from the inside. Damien stepped through. The presidential suite was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue and the lake beyond, modern furniture arranged with architectural precision, original artwork on the walls. The kind of space that cost 5 figures a night and made you feel simultaneously powerful and insignificant. 6 men stood positioned throughout the room, all armed, all watching Damien with the blank expressions of people who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. And sitting in a leather chair near the windows, backlit by the setting sun, so his face was half in shadow, was Alessandro DeLuca. Damien had seen photographs, had read intelligence reports, had heard the stories. None of it prepared him for the reality. Alessandro was 73 years old and looked like mortality had decided to make an exception. Tall, slender, impeccably dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit that probably cost more than a car. Silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome once, but had been refined by decades into something aristocratic and terrible. Dark eyes that didn't blink. Hands folded across his lap with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd ordered hundreds of executions and lost exactly 0 hours of sleep over them. He looked like someone's elegant grandfather. He looked like the angel of death on a coffee break. "Mr. Moretti," Alessandro said. His voice was quiet, cultured, with just a trace of an Italian accent that suggested old-world roots. "Thank you for coming." Damien's mouth went dry. "I was invited," he managed, "and you came alone, as requested." Alessandro gestured to one of the other chairs. "Please, sit." It wasn't a request. Damien sat. Alessandro regarded him in silence for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. Those dark eyes catalogued everything, posture, breathing, the tremor in Damien's hands that he couldn't quite control. "You humiliated my granddaughter," Alessandro finally said. No preamble, no build-up, just the statement hanging in the air like a noose. "Yes," Damien replied. "No point in denying it. You called her trash in front of 500 witnesses. You had her physically removed from a public event. You mocked her clothing, her status, her worth as a human being." Alessandro's voice never rose above conversational. "And you did this because a drunk woman pushed her and she accidentally spilled your drink." "Yes." "Why?" The question caught Damien off guard. "I don't understand. Why?" Alessandro repeated, and something in his tone made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. "I want to understand what motivated you to treat another human being, a young woman who had done nothing to you, who apologized immediately, who posed no threat whatsoever, with such calculated cruelty. Explain it to me." Damien's mind raced. Every instinct screamed to deflect, to minimize, to make excuses, but Alessandro De Luca wasn't the kind of man you lied to. Because I could, Damien said. Because she was powerless and I wasn't. Because humiliating someone weaker made me feel strong. He swallowed. Because I'm a vicious bastard who built an empire on the understanding that mercy is weakness and cruelty is power. Silence. Alessandro's expression didn't change. At least you're honest, the old Don finally said. That's more than I expected. He stood in one fluid motion, surprisingly graceful for a man in his 70s, and walked to the windows. Chicago spread out beneath them, lights beginning to glow as evening descended. My son Marco, Alessandro said quietly, still looking at the city, was the best man I ever knew, kind, thoughtful. He hated violence, hated what our family does. He paused. When his daughter was born, he made me promise something. He made me swear that Celine would never be touched by this life, that she would grow up normal, safe, free. Damien said nothing. I kept that promise, Alessandro continued. I sent her to the best schools in Europe, kept her completely separate from the business, let her build a life that had nothing to do with ports and shipping routes and money laundering. He turned back to face Damien. And then you confirmed every fear Marco ever had. You proved that the world will always see her as a target, that safety is an illusion, that men like you exist. I'm sorry, Damien said, and meant it with a desperation that surprised him. Alessandro smiled. It was the saddest, most terrifying smile Damien had ever seen. I don't want your apology, the old Don said softly. I want your humility. Before Damien could respond, Alessandro walked to a side table and picked up an ornate espresso cup. He sipped slowly, deliberately, making Damien wait. Tomorrow night, Alessandro finally said, the mayor is hosting an exclusive gala at the Field Museum. The Platinum Circle benefit, 500 guests, mostly the same people who attended last night's charity event. He set down the cup. You will escort my granddaughter to that gala as an honored guest. You will introduce her to every important person there. You will publicly apologize for your behavior and restore her dignity in front of the same society that witnessed her humiliation. Damien's brain tried to process what he was hearing. And if I refuse? Alessandro's smile widened fractionally. Then my men will kill you before you reach the lobby. Your consigliere waiting downstairs will be dead within the hour, and your organization will be dismantled piece by piece over the next month until nothing remains but cautionary tales. The words were delivered with the same calm tone Alessandro might use to discuss the weather. But I don't think you'll refuse, the old Don continued. Because you're a survivor, Mr. Moretti. You've built an empire through calculation and ruthlessness. You understand cost-benefit analysis. He stepped closer, and Damien smelled expensive cologne and something underneath that might have been gun oil. Your pride or your life, simple equation. And if she feels disrespected, Damien asked, even for a second? Alessandro's expression went completely flat. Then you die screaming. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I'll have 12 men positioned throughout the museum, Alessandro continued. Trained marksmen. If Cellini signals discomfort, if she looks unhappy, if she feels undermined, if you fail to treat her with absolute respect, they'll put 3 rounds in your chest before you hit the ground. He tilted his head slightly. Do we understand each other? Damien couldn't breathe properly. This was worse than execution. This was controlled humiliation, public submission, the complete dismantling of every power structure Damien had spent a decade building, forced to play out in front of Chicago's elite. This was Alessandro De Luca proving that Damien wasn't a king. He was a subject who'd forgotten his place. I understand, Damien managed. Good. Alessandro walked back to his chair and sat with the easy grace of someone who'd just concluded a minor business transaction. My men will provide you with the details. Where to pick up Celine, what time to arrive, how to behave. I suggest you follow their instructions precisely. He picked up his espresso cup again, sipped delicately. The meeting was over. Damien stood on legs that felt like water and walked toward the door. The guards moved to flank him, professional and silent. Mr. Moretti. He stopped, looked back. Alessandro was watching him with those terrible dark eyes. My granddaughter is the most important thing in my world, the old Don said quietly. She is the only family I have left, the only reminder that my son existed. He paused. If you fail tomorrow night, I won't just kill you. I'll erase you, your name, your empire, your legacy. All of it will disappear like it never existed. Another pause. But if you succeed, if you prove that you can learn from your mistakes and treat her with the dignity she deserves, then perhaps we can discuss a different future. Damien's heart hammered against his ribs. What kind of future? Alessandro smiled again, that sad, terrible smile. One where you survive, he said. One where my granddaughter has an ally in Chicago instead of an enemy. One where you become the kind of man who deserves the power he wields. The smile faded. But first you have to prove you're capable of... The door to the presidential suite closed behind Damien with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid settling into place. He stood in the hallway for 5 seconds that felt like 5 years, trying to remember how to breathe properly. His hands were shaking, not trembling, full body shaking like he'd been dropped in ice water. One of Alessandro's guards stood nearby, expressionless, waiting to escort him back to the elevator. Damien walked. His legs worked on autopilot while his brain tried to process what had just happened. Alessandro De Luca, the ghost of the East Coast, the man who'd allegedly ended entire criminal organizations over insults smaller than what Damien had done, had given him a chance. Not mercy, not forgiveness. A chance to publicly humiliate himself in front of the same society that had watched him humiliate Celine, with snipers positioned throughout the venue, ready to execute him if she felt disrespected for even 1 second. The elevator ride down felt like descending into hell in slow motion. Damien watched the numbers decrease, 23, 22, 21, and tried to figure out how his life had become a death sentence with performance requirements. The doors opened onto the lobby. Roman was standing near the concierge desk, phone in hand, face gray with tension. When he saw Damien alive and walking, something like relief flooded his expression before professional composure locked back into place. They didn't speak until they were in the car, doors closed, moving into evening traffic. "Well?" Roman asked. Damien told him everything. Roman listened without interrupting, his face going from gray to white to something approaching green as Damien described Alessandro's terms. When Damien finished, his consigliere sat in silence for almost a full minute. "Snipers," Roman finally said. 12 of them. Positioned throughout the field museum. "Yes." "With orders to kill you if Celine De Luca feels disrespected in any way." "That's the deal." Roman turned to look at Damien with an expression that suggested he was watching a man who'd already died and just didn't know it yet. "This is insane," Roman said flatly. "You're walking into a public execution dressed up as a gala. Alessandro isn't giving you a chance. He's making a spectacle out of your death." "Maybe," Damien replied. "Or maybe he's doing exactly what he said, testing whether I can learn humility. You don't have a humble bone in your body. Then I guess tomorrow night I find out if I can grow some." The car stopped at a red light. Outside the windows, Chicago moved through its Saturday evening routine. Couples heading to dinner, groups of friends laughing outside bars, normal people living normal lives where crime lords didn't threaten them with sniper rifles. Damien envied every single one of them. "There has to be another option," Roman said. "We could run. Get you out of the city tonight. I've got contacts in Vancouver, Rio, Dubai, places where even De Luca's reach has limits." "His reach doesn't have limits," Damien replied. "You said it yourself. He controls ports from New York to Miami. He's got connections in Europe, South America, probably Asia. There's nowhere I could run that he wouldn't eventually find me." Eventually gives you time to plan, to build new defenses. Eventually means living the rest of my life waiting for a bullet I'll never see coming. Damien shook his head. "I'd rather face it on my terms, on my ground, than spend 20 years looking over my shoulder." Roman made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Your ground?" "Damien, you don't have ground anymore. Alessandro dismantled your security, froze your accounts, turned your political allies into ghosts. You're not on your ground. You're in his world now." The light turned green. The car moved forward. "Then I adapt," Damien said. Back at his penthouse, Damien spent the rest of the evening doing something he'd never done in his entire criminal career. preparing to submit. He went through his wardrobe 3 times, trying to figure out what someone wore to their own controlled humiliation. Too expensive looked like arrogance. Too casual looked like disrespect. He finally settled on a charcoal Tom Ford suit. Elegant, but not ostentatious. Expensive, but not flashy. The kind of thing someone wore when they wanted to be taken seriously, but not dominate the room. Then he practiced apologizing, stood in front of his bathroom mirror like an insane person, rehearsing different versions of public contrition. Tried to figure out what words would adequately express remorse for calling someone trash without sounding either pathetic or insincere. Every version made him want to put his fist through the glass. Because the truth was, Damian Moretti didn't apologize. He leveraged, he negotiated, he made problems disappear through money or violence or political pressure. But Alessandro De Luca had removed all those options. All that remained was the one thing Damian had never learned how to do: admit he was wrong. Sunday morning arrived with pale winter sunlight that made Chicago look almost beautiful. Damian hadn't slept more than an hour total. He sat in his office drinking coffee that tasted like battery acid and watching the news coverage of yesterday's charity gala. The video of him humiliating Celine was everywhere now. Network news, cable channels, social media. Some outlets were running think pieces about toxic masculinity and wealth inequality. Others were doing background investigations into both Damian and Celine, though notably, none of them had uncovered her real identity. Alessandro's people had buried that information deep. By noon, Damian's phone had received 43 calls from business associates, political contacts, and syndicate intermediaries, all wanting to know what was happening, all sensing blood in the water. He ignored every single one. At 4 o'clock, a text arrived from an unknown number. "Car will pick you up at 5:30. Be ready." No signature. Didn't need one. Damian showered, dressed in the Tom Ford suit, and spent 30 minutes in front of the mirror making sure every detail was perfect. Hair combed precisely, tie knotted correctly, shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like someone going to a funeral. His own, probably. At 5:30 exactly, his phone buzzed. The car was downstairs. Roman appeared in the doorway of Damian's bedroom, holding a rocks glass with 2 fingers of whiskey. "Liquid courage," he said, offering the glass. Damian took it, drained it in one swallow. "If I don't come back," he started. "You're coming back," Roman interrupted, "because you're a vicious, calculating bastard who's survived worse than this. I've never survived 12 snipers in Alessandro De Luca." "Then adapt." Roman's expression was grim. "Like you said, adapt or die." The car waiting downstairs was a black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows. 2 of Alessandro's men sat in front, different guards than yesterday, but the same flat professional stare. They didn't speak when Damian climbed into the back seat, just pulled smoothly into traffic and headed north. The drive to Wicker Park took 20 minutes. Damian watched the city slide past and tried to imagine what version of Celine De Luca would be waiting for him. The trembling woman from the gala? The cold, composed bookstore clerk? The terrifying heir who'd warned him about standing in gasoline? All of them, probably. The car stopped outside a converted warehouse building. One of the guards turned in his seat. "Top floor," he said. "Apartment 4C. You have 15 minutes." Damian climbed out. The building was nicer than he'd expected. Exposed brick, industrial windows, the kind of gentrified warehouse space that young professionals paid a fortune to call authentic. He took the stairs because waiting for an elevator felt like torture, reached the 4th floor breathing harder than he should have been. Apartment 4C had a simple black door with a brass knocker. Damian knocked. The door opened, and Damian forgot how to form coherent thoughts. Celine stood in the doorway wearing a midnight blue velvet gown that transformed her from bookstore clerk into something out of a Renaissance painting. The dress had long sleeves and a high neckline, elegant, sophisticated, nothing revealing, but it fit her perfectly, moving with her body in a way that suggested custom tailoring. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate style that exposed her neck. Diamond earrings caught the light. Minimal makeup, but applied with professional precision that enhanced features Damian had barely noticed before. She looked aristocratic, untouchable, devastating. "You're staring," Celine said. Damian's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "You look beautiful." I look expensive, Celine corrected. There's a difference. She stepped back from the doorway. Come in. We need to establish ground rules. Damien entered a small but immaculately decorated apartment. Hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with volumes in multiple languages, a vintage leather couch, artwork that looked original. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, something orchestral that Damien didn't recognize. The space felt lived in, real. Nothing like the sterile luxury of Damien's penthouse. Ground rules, Celine repeated, turning to face him. Tonight, you will introduce me to everyone important. You will apologize publicly and specifically for calling me trash. You will treat me with absolute respect. She paused. And you will not touch me unless I give explicit permission. Understood. I'm serious about the touching, Celine continued. My grandfather's men are watching for any sign of discomfort. If you put your hand on my back without warning, if you grab my arm, if you invade my personal space, they'll interpret that as threatening behavior. I understand, Damien said again. Celine studied him with those dark, evaluating eyes. Do you? She asked quietly. Do you actually understand what's happening here? This isn't theater. This isn't performance. You humiliated me in front of 500 people, and now you're going to undo that damage in front of the same audience. Her voice was cold. This is about restoring my dignity, not saving your life. I know. Do you? Celine stepped closer. Because here's what I think. I think you're going through the motions because you're afraid of my grandfather. I think you'd say anything, do anything to survive. But I don't think you actually understand why what you did was wrong. The words hit harder than they should have. You're right, Damien admitted. 3 days ago, I wouldn't have cared. I would have seen you as collateral damage in a world where only power matters. He met her eyes. But I've spent the last 48 hours watching my empire crack apart because I treated you like you were worthless. And the worst part isn't the consequences. It's realizing you were right about me. Celine's expression flickered. Right about what? That I only respect people when I'm afraid of them, Damien said. That cruelty is all I know. That underneath the suits and the reputation, I'm exactly what you called me. Someone standing in gasoline who never notices until the match is lit. For several seconds, Celine just stared at him. Then she walked to a side table, picked up a small clutch purse, and turned back. We should go, she said. The car is waiting. They rode to the Field Museum in silence. Celine sat on one side of the back seat, Damien on the other, careful not to invade her space. The guards in front didn't speak. Nobody spoke. Chicago's evening skyline glowed through the tinted windows as they headed south toward the museum campus. Damien tried not to think about the 12 snipers Alessandro had positioned throughout the venue. Tried not to imagine crosshairs tracking him through crowds. Tried not to think about dying. The Field Museum rose up ahead of them, a massive neoclassical building that looked like a Greek temple crossed with a palace. Floodlights illuminated the white stone facade. A red carpet stretched up the front steps where valets were parking luxury vehicles and photographers snapped pictures of arriving guests. Chicago's elite, gathering for another charity gala, where Damien Moretti would either restore his reputation or get 3 bullets in his chest. The Mercedes pulled up to the red carpet. One of the guards turned in his seat. Remember the rules, he said to Damien. Respect, dignity, no physical contact without permission. He paused. And smile. You're supposed to look honored to be here. The door opened. Damien climbed out, turned, and offered his hand to help Celine from the car. She hesitated for just a moment, long enough that Damien wondered if this was already over, then placed her gloved hand in his and stepped onto the red carpet. Cameras exploded in flashing light. Photographers surged forward, shouting questions. Mr. Moretti, who's your date? Miss, what's your name? Is this the woman from the viral video? Damien felt Celine's hand tighten fractionally on his arm. Not fear, just acknowledgement that this was happening. This was real. They walked up the red carpet together. The Field Museum's main hall was breathtaking. A soaring space dominated by 2 massive elephant displays and Sue the T-Rex, the famous Tyrannosaurus skeleton towering over everything. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling. White draped tables surrounded a central dance floor. A full orchestra played on a raised platform. And everywhere, Chicago's most powerful people, senators, billionaires, corporate CEOs. The The same 500 faces who'd witnessed Damien's cruelty 2 nights ago now gathered to watch his submission. The room went quiet when Damien and Celine entered. Not completely silent. The orchestra kept playing. Conversations continued in hushed whispers. But the ambient noise dropped noticeably as heads turned and people began pointing. Damien felt those stares like physical weight. "Breathe," Celine murmured beside him. "You look like you're about to pass out." "I might be." "Don't." Her voice was still cold but contained something that might have been encouragement. "You start this strong, or you don't start at all." Damien straightened his spine, lifted his chin, and walked into the crowd like a king entering hostile territory. The first person to approach was Mayor Patricia Chen, a tiny woman in her 60s who'd spent 3 decades mastering Chicago politics through charm and calculated ruthlessness. She looked at Damien and Celine with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. "Damien," she said carefully, "what a surprise to see you." "Mayor Chen," Damien's voice was steady. "I'd like to introduce Celine DeLuca. She's—" "I know who she is," the mayor interrupted. Her eyes flicked to Celine. "The woman from the video. The one you called trash in front of my donors." The words hung in the air like a slap. Damien felt rage surge up his throat, the instinctive fury of being challenged, being disrespected, and forced it down through sheer willpower. "Which is why I'm here tonight," he said quietly. "To apologize." Mayor Chen's eyebrows rose. "Publicly," Damien continued, each word costing him something, "I treated Miss DeLuca with inexcusable cruelty. I humiliated her because I could, because she appeared powerless, because I'm exactly the kind of man who mistakes fear for respect." He paused. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The mayor stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Selena's expression remained carefully neutral, but Damien saw her shoulders relax fractionally. "Well," Mayor Chen finally said, "that's certainly unexpected." She turned to Celine. "Miss DeLuca, I hope you'll accept my personal apology as well. What happened at the Blackstone Gala was unacceptable, and several of us should have intervened." "Thank you, Mayor," Celine replied, her voice warm and gracious in a way Damien had never heard before. "I appreciate that." The mayor nodded and moved away, already pulling out her phone, probably texting everyone she knew that Damien Moretti had just publicly apologized. "One down," Celine murmured. 499 to go. The next hour was the most excruciating experience of Damien's life. He worked the room with Celine, introducing her to every important person in Chicago, and at each introduction, he apologized. To Senator Morrison, who controlled federal funding for infrastructure projects Damien's shipping company depended on. To the Ashfords, the couple whose drunken collision had started this nightmare. To Julia Brennan, a Tribune columnist who'd written 3 hit pieces about Damien's alleged criminal connections. To CEOs and philanthropists and society wives and political operatives. Every single conversation ended with the same basic script. I was cruel. I was wrong. I'm sorry. And every apology cost him something. Pride. Reputation. The carefully constructed image of invincibility he'd spent a decade building. By the time they reached the main ballroom, Damien felt hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and carved away everything that made him who he was. But Celine's posture had shifted. She stood straighter now, smiled more genuinely, engaged in conversations with the kind of natural charm that suggested she'd been trained in high society etiquette from birth, which she probably had been. People were responding to her, treating her with respect. Several women had complimented her dress. A tech CEO had asked about her bookstore. She was being seen, not as trash, not as powerless, not as the humiliated victim from a viral video, as someone who mattered. Damien realized with uncomfortable clarity that this was what Alessandro had demanded. Not just an apology, a restoration of dignity that could only happen if Damien treated his granddaughter like she deserved respect in front of the same people who'd watched her humiliation. They were standing near one of the dinosaur displays, catching their breath between conversations, when a voice cut through the ambient noise. Well, look at this touching display." Damien turned. Marco Vescari stood 10 feet away, champagne in hand, surrounded by 3 of his men. Vescari was a mid-level boss who controlled gambling and protection in Little Italy, not important enough to threaten Damien's empire, but connected enough to be dangerous. Mid-40s, stocky, with slicked back hair, and a face that looked like it had been rearranged by too many fists. He was also drunk and mean. Damien Moretti, Vescari continued, voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby guests. Groveling like a dog. Never thought I'd see the day. Damien's jaw tightened. Vescari, he said carefully, this isn't the time. Isn't the time? Vescari laughed, an ugly sound. You humiliate some girl at a gala, it goes viral, and now you're parading her around like she's the Queen of England? He gestured with his champagne glass sloshing liquid. That's pathetic. You're pathetic. Selini's hand touched Damien's arm, a warning. Don't engage. But Vescari wasn't done. And you, he said, turning bloodshot eyes on Celine. You must be something special to bring the great Damien Moretti to his knees. His smile was leering. How much does he pay you? Or maybe you're doing this for free. Some girls like the power trip. The room went very quiet. Damien felt rage explode through his chest, pure incandescent fury that demanded violence. But before he could move, before he could speak, Celine stepped forward. Her posture hadn't changed. Her expression remained calm, but something in her eyes made Vescari's smile falter. Mr. Vescari, she said quietly, you run protection in Little Italy, correct? Taylor Street specifically? Vescari blinked, confused by the shift. Yeah, so what? And you have business relationships with the Morales cartel, Celine continued, voice still conversational. Laundering their drug proceeds through your legitimate businesses, the Italian grocery on Oakley, the construction company on Western. Vescari's face went pale. How the fuck do you... You also have a brother, Celine interrupted. Vincent Vescari, currently hiding from a federal warrant in a safe house outside Milwaukee. 23,000 West Parkway Drive, specifically. Complete silence now. Your distribution routes run through Gary and Hammond, Celine said, each fact delivered with surgical precision. You move product every Tuesday night using refrigerated trucks registered to a shell company called Midwest Fresh Foods. Your contact at the Gary port is a longshoreman named Eddie Sullivan, who takes 15% off the top. Vescari looked like he'd been gutted. You're insane, he whispered. There's no way you could know. I know everything, Celine said softly. I know about the $2 million in cash hidden in your brother's basement. I know about the federal prosecutor building a RICO case against you. I know that if I wanted to, I could make one phone call and have your entire operation crushed like an insect. She stepped closer. So, when I offer you a choice between apologizing for disrespecting me and watching your empire burn to the ground, she continued, voice dropping to something deadly, I suggest you choose carefully. Vescari stared at her with the expression of a man watching his own execution. I apologize, he stammered. I didn't mean, please, I'm sorry. Celine smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Damien had ever seen. She snapped her fingers once, a sharp, precise sound that cut through the silence. 6 men materialized from the crowd. Not security guards, not random guests. DeLuca enforcers. They'd been there the whole time, invisible among the 500 attendees, and Damien had never noticed. The 6 men moved with coordinated efficiency. Within seconds, Vescari's 3 bodyguards were disarmed and pinned against pillars. Vescari himself was grabbed by 2 enforcers who lifted him off his feet like he weighed nothing. The crowd backed away, gasping. Wait, Vescari screamed. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't know who she was. Celine watched him struggle with the detached interest of someone observing an insect. Take him outside, she said. My grandfather will decide what happens next. The enforcers dragged Vescari toward the exit. His screaming echoed through the museum hall until the doors closed and cut off the sound. The entire interaction had taken less than 60 seconds. Celine smoothed her velvet dress, picked up her champagne glass from where she'd set it on a nearby table, and took a delicate sip. Then she turned back to the crowd like absolutely nothing had happened. I believe there's a silent auction starting soon, she said pleasantly. Shall we take a look? The guests stared at her in stunned silence. Then, slowly, conversations resumed. The orchestra started playing again. People moved toward the auction tables like the room hadn't just witnessed a casual demonstration of terrifying power. Damien stood frozen, his entire understanding of reality rearranging itself. Celine hadn't needed protection. She had never needed protection. She was the storm wrapped in velvet and diamonds. She turned to him, and for the first time that night, her expression showed something genuine, amusement. "You're staring again," she said. "You just—" Damien couldn't form words. "How did you know all that about Vescari?" "My grandfather controls intelligence networks across 3 continents," Celine replied. "Did you think I grew up in Europe reading fairy tales?" She sipped her champagne. "I was educated in languages, politics, finance, and operational security. I can speak 5 languages fluently, analyze shipping manifests for irregularities, and recite the organizational structure of every major syndicate from Boston to Sicily." Damien felt something shift in his chest. Not fear. Not exactly. Something closer to awe. "You've been pretending," he said slowly. "The whole time. The bookstore, the modest apartment, the invisibility. It's all a mask." "Of course it's a mask," Celine replied. "My grandfather wanted me to have something normal, something mine. But normal doesn't mean powerless." She met his eyes. "I am Alessandro De Luca's heir. I was always going to inherit his empire. The only question was whether I'd be ready." "And are you?" Celine's smile widened. "What do you think?" Before Damien could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, saw a text from an unknown number. "You've done well tonight. One more thing remains. The museum's West Terrace. 10 minutes. Come alone. Alessandro." Damien showed the text to Celine. Her expression went carefully neutral. "He wants to speak with you privately," she said. "About what?" "I don't know." Celine set down her champagne glass. "But if my grandfather summons you, you go." 10 minutes later, Damien stood alone on the Field Museum's West Terrace overlooking Grant Park and Lake Michigan beyond. Wind cut across the stone balcony, cold enough to make him grateful for his suit jacket. The city spread out beneath him, millions of lights, millions of lives, a kingdom he'd thought he ruled. How naive he'd been. Footsteps behind him. Damien turned. Alessandro De Luca emerged from the shadows near the terrace entrance, alone for the first time since Damien had met him. The old Don walked to the stone railing and stood beside Damien, both of them looking out at Chicago. "You surprised me tonight," Alessandro said quietly. "How?" "You actually meant the apologies." Alessandro glanced at him. "I expected theater, performance, the kind of hollow contrition powerful men offer when forced, but you genuinely regretted what you did." Damien didn't know how to respond to that. "My granddaughter is remarkable," Alessandro continued. "Brilliant, capable, strong enough to lead empires." He paused. "But she's also lonely. She spent her entire childhood isolated from other children because of who her family is. She built a quiet life in Chicago because she wanted something real, something that wasn't about power or fear." The wind gusted across the terrace. "And then you confirmed every nightmare I've had," Alessandro said. "You proved that the world will always see her as either a target or a pawn. That safety is an illusion, that men like you exist." "I know," Damien said quietly. "Do you?" Alessandro turned to face him fully. "Because here's what I've decided. You're going to prove you've learned something from this experience." Damien's stomach dropped. "How?" "By becoming an ally instead of a threat," Alessandro replied. "My granddaughter needs someone in Chicago who understands the life but won't try to control her. Someone who's powerful enough to be useful but humble enough to respect her autonomy." He paused. "Someone who's been humiliated enough to understand the value of dignity." "You're talking about a partnership." "I'm talking about protection," Alessandro corrected. "Celine wants to stay in Chicago. She loves this city, and I can't be here permanently to ensure her safety." His eyes locked onto Damien's. "So you will be." "And if I refuse?" Alessandro's expression didn't change. "Then you die tonight. My men will make it look like a heart attack. Very tragic, very sudden." He smiled slightly. "But I don't think you'll refuse, because you're starting to understand that real power isn't about domination. It's about knowing when to submit." Damien looked out at Chicago's glowing skyline and made a decision that would change everything. "What do you need me to do?" Alessandro's smile widened. "Exactly what you've been doing tonight," he said. "Respect her, protect her, treat her like the remarkable woman she is." He paused. "And never, ever mistake her mercy for weakness again." I won't. Good. Alessandro turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Marco Vescari will disappear tonight. His organization will be absorbed by my people. His brother in Milwaukee will be delivered to federal authorities. The old Don's voice went cold. Anyone who disrespects my granddaughter learns that lesson permanently. He walked away, footsteps echoing across stone, leaving Damien alone on the terrace. Damien stood there for a long time, wind cutting through his expensive suit, staring at the city he'd thought he owned, and realized he'd never owned anything. He'd just been allowed to play king until someone more powerful decided otherwise. Inside the museum, the gala continued. Damien made his way back through crowds that now looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. Not for him, but for the woman on his arm. Celine stood near the orchestra, speaking with a group of society wives who hung on her every word. She looked like she'd been born to this. When she saw Damien approaching, she excused herself and walked over. "Well?" she asked quietly. "Your grandfather made me an offer," Damien replied. "And?" "I accepted." Something shifted in Celine's expression, calculation mixing with what might have been relief. "So you're my ally now," she said. "My protector in Chicago." "If you'll have me." Celine studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, genuinely warm for the first time since they'd met. "We'll see," she said. "You've had 2 good nights. Let's see if you can manage a third." Before Damien could respond, she took his arm and guided him back into the crowd. And somewhere high in the museum's rafters, hidden among the shadows and architectural details, 12 snipers quietly lowered their rifles. The test was over. Damien Moretti had survived. But the man who walked out of the Field Museum that night was fundamentally different from the man who'd walked in. He'd learned what real power looked like, and it terrified him in ways violence never had. The penthouse felt different when Damien returned that night. Same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Same minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Same abstract art hanging on walls he'd never really looked at. But everything felt fundamentally altered, like returning to a house you'd lived in for years and discovering the walls had shifted 3 inches to the left while you were gone. Damien stood in the center of his living room at 2 in the morning, still wearing the Tom Ford suit, and tried to process the past 72 hours. He'd publicly humiliated Alessandro De Luca's granddaughter. He'd been threatened with systematic execution. He'd apologized in front of Chicago's entire elite. And now he was apparently Selena De Luca's designated protector. His phone buzzed. Roman. "You're alive," his consigliere said without preamble. "Barely. The news is covering the gala. You and Selena De Luca are everywhere. People are calling it the most dramatic public apology in Chicago history." Roman paused. "Also, Marco Vescari is missing. His entire crew is spooked. Word on the street is Alessandro De Luca disappeared him." "He did," Damien confirmed, in front of 500 witnesses. Silence on the line. "Damien," Roman said carefully, "what exactly happened tonight?" Damien told him everything. The introductions, the apologies, Vescari's drunken insult, Cellini's terrifying demonstration of power, Alessandro's final terms. When he finished, Roman was quiet for almost a full minute. "So you're working for Alessandro De Luca now," he finally said. "I'm working with his granddaughter," Damien corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you just became a subordinate in someone else's empire." The words stung because they were partially true. "Alessandro gave me a choice," Damien replied. "Become Celine's ally or die. I chose survival." "And what happens when Celine decides she doesn't need an ally anymore?" Roman's voice was sharp. "What happens when Alessandro decides you've outlived your usefulness? You've spent a decade building an independent empire, and now you're a footnote in someone else's operation." "I know. Do you? Because I watched you build this organization from nothing. I watched you take territory your father never could have held. And now you're throwing it away because some woman humiliated you into submission." Damien's jaw tightened. "That woman," he said quietly, "had 6 armed men hidden in a crowd of 500 without me noticing. She knows operational details about organizations I've never even heard of. She made Marco Vescari, a made man with 20 years in the life, piss himself with fear in under 60 seconds. He paused. She's not just some woman, Roman. She's the most dangerous person I've ever met. Which is exactly why allying with her is insane, Roman shot back. You don't partner with people more powerful than you. You either submit completely or you eliminate them. I can't eliminate her? Then you've already submitted. The call ended. Damien stood alone in his penthouse, Roman's words echoing through the silence, and wondered if his consigliere was right. Had he just traded his empire for survival? He poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, the expensive stuff, not the 30-year Macallan he'd been wearing when this nightmare started, and walked to the windows. Chicago spread out beneath him, lights glittering like a universe he'd once controlled. Once. Past tense. Because the truth was, Alessandro De Luca had dismantled Damien's understanding of power in less than 72 hours. Had proven that money and territory and political connections meant nothing when someone with deeper resources decided you were a problem. And Selena De Luca had proven something even more terrifying. That intelligence was more dangerous than violence, that control was more powerful than fear, that a woman in a velvet gown could destroy a man's empire with a snap of her fingers. Damien's phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Tomorrow. Noon. The bookstore. We need to discuss operational parameters. S. Celine. Already establishing routines, already assuming authority, already treating their partnership like what it actually was. A subordination dressed up as collaboration. Damien drained his whiskey and went to bed without sleeping. The next morning arrived with brutal winter sunlight that made his hangover feel like someone driving nails through his skull. Damien showered, dressed in dark jeans and a black sweater, deliberately casual, deliberately not the armor of a suit, and headed to Wicker Park. The turning page looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago. Same narrow brick building, same hand-lettered signs in the window, same used books stacked in the display. But when Damien pushed open the door, the bell chiming his arrival, he saw the difference immediately. 2 men sat at a small table near the back of the store, both reading newspapers, both carrying concealed weapons that Damien recognized from the bulge under their jackets. De Luca's security. Celine emerged from behind a shelf of poetry collections, carrying a stack of books that she set down on the counter. She wore jeans and an oversized cardigan, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, looking exactly like a bookstore clerk, except for her eyes. Those dark, evaluating eyes that had watched Marco Viscari get dragged away screaming. "You're early," she said. "I'm punctual." "There's a difference." Celine gestured to a small reading nook near the front windows where 2 armchairs faced each other across a coffee table. "Sit. We have things to discuss." Damien sat. Celine took the opposite chair, crossed her legs, and studied him with the same clinical precision she might use to examine a specimen under glass. "My grandfather left Chicago this morning," she said. "Back to New York. He's satisfied that you've learned appropriate humility." "How generous." "Don't!" Celine's voice went sharp. "Don't do that thing where you pretend to be resentful about consequences you brought on yourself. You humiliated me. You faced appropriate repercussions. If you can't accept that without passive-aggressive commentary, we're done before we start." Damien bit back his automatic response and forced himself to nod. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." Celine's expression softened fractionally. "Better." She leaned back in her chair. "Here's the reality. My grandfather wants me to stay in Chicago. He wants me to have a normal life, or as normal as possible given who I am. But he also wants assurance that I'm protected. Which is where I come in." "Yes." Celine tilted her head slightly. "You control significant territory in Chicago. You have political connections, shipping infrastructure, and enough operational experience to recognize threats. You're useful." The word stung more than it should have. "And what do I get out of this arrangement?" Damien asked. "You survive," Celine replied. "You maintain your empire. You continue running your operations without interference from my grandfather's organization." She paused. "And you gain access to De Luca intelligence networks that will make your business significantly more profitable." Damien's business instincts kicked in despite himself. "What kind of intelligence?" "Port schedules, federal investigation targets, competitor vulnerabilities, supply chain disruptions before they happen." Celine smiled slightly. My grandfather controls information infrastructure across 3 continents. He knows when federal prosecutors are building cases 6 months before indictments drop. He knows which politicians are about to flip on corruption charges. He knows everything. And he'd share that with me? If you prove loyal to me, yes. The calculation was simple. Access to DeLuca intelligence would make Damien's shipping operation untouchable, would let him move product through ports that competitors didn't even know existed, would give him advance warning on every threat before it materialized. It would make him richer than he'd ever been, and completely dependent on Celine's goodwill. There's a catch, Damien said. Of course there's a catch. Celine leaned forward slightly. You work for me now. Not officially. We'll maintain the appearance of separate operations. But functionally, your empire answers to mine. I don't interfere with your day-to-day business, but when I need something, you provide it. No questions. No hesitation. And if I refuse? Celine's smile was sad and terrible. Then my grandfather reconsiders whether you've actually learned humility, she said quietly, and you discover that surviving one test doesn't mean you've passed the course. Damien looked at this woman, this 20-something bookstore clerk in a cardigan who commanded armed enforcers and spoke about dismantling empires like discussing weather, and made his choice. What do you need? Celine's smile widened into something genuine. Smart man. She stood, walked to the bookstore counter, and pulled out a tablet, returned to the reading nook and set it on the coffee table between them. The screen showed a photograph of a man in his 50s, expensively dressed, standing outside what looked like a corporate office building. Vincent Castellano, Celine said, CEO of Castellano Development, owns half the commercial real estate in the Loop, also runs a protection racket that extorts small businesses, launders money through construction projects, and has connections to every corrupt alderman in the city. Damien recognized the name. Castellano was old-school Chicago corruption, the kind of operator who'd survived multiple federal investigations by being smarter and more connected than the prosecutors hunting him. What about him? He's become a problem, Celine replied. 3 weeks ago, one of his collectors threatened the owner of a Korean restaurant in Chinatown. The owner refused to pay, said he already had protection. Castellano's man broke both the owner's hands with a hammer. Damien's stomach turned. The owner's daughter, Celine continued, voice still quiet, works for one of my grandfather's subsidiary operations in New York. She called my grandfather personally, asked for help. And Alessandro sent you. No. Celine's eyes went cold. My grandfather wanted to send a full crew. Burn down Castellano's buildings, kill his men, make an example that would be felt for a generation. She paused. I convinced him to let me handle it differently. How? By proving I can dismantle threats without starting wars. Celine met Damien's eyes. Which is where you come in. Castellano operates in your territory. You've probably had business dealings with him, or at least been aware of his operations. Damien nodded slowly. We've crossed paths. He wanted protection payments from some of my shipping warehouses last year. I told him to fuck off. And he backed down? Eventually. After I made it clear what would happen if he didn't. Celine smiled. Good. That means he knows you're dangerous, which makes this easier. She tapped the tablet screen and a new image appeared. Financial records, bank accounts, transaction histories. Castellano's been stealing from his own organization, Celine said. Skimming off the top, hiding money in offshore accounts that his partners don't know about. Approximately $8 million over the past 3 years. Damien whistled softly. His partners would kill him if they found out. Exactly. Celine's smile widened. So you're going to tell them? Me? You have the connections, the credibility. If you call a meeting with Castellano's major partners and present them with evidence of his theft, they'll turn on him immediately. She paused. Castellano's empire collapses without a single bullet fired. His protection rackets get absorbed by people who won't terrorize small business owners. And the Korean restaurant owner's daughter gets justice. Damien stared at the tablet, his mind racing through the logistics. Castellano's partners are dangerous men, he said. If I'm the one bringing them evidence of betrayal, they'll wonder why. They'll question my motives. So give them a motive, Celine replied. Tell them Castellano's been planning to move against them. Tell them you discovered his theft during your own intelligence gathering. Tell them whatever story makes you the ally who saved them from betrayal. And what do I actually get out of this? Celine leaned back in her chair, studied him for a long moment. You get to prove you're capable of executing complex operations that serve my interests, she said. You get to demonstrate loyalty, and if you succeed, you get access to DeLuca intelligence that will make your shipping operation untouchable for the next 5 years. The offer was calculated perfectly, appealing to Damien's ambition while making it clear this was a test. When do you need this done? He asked. This week. Selene stood. Castellano's been getting bolder, more violent. I want him gone before he hurts anyone else. Damien stood as well, his body moving on autopilot while his brain processed the magnitude of what he'd just agreed to. He was about to dismantle another crime boss's empire, on Selene DeLuca's orders, like a soldier following commands. I'll need access to those financial records, he said. Selene handed him the tablet. Everything you need is there. Account numbers, transaction histories, transfer dates. Enough evidence to bury Castellano 3 times over. Damien took the tablet, felt its weight in his hands like a weapon. One question, he said. How did you get this information? These are offshore accounts hidden behind shell corporations. Even federal investigators would have trouble tracking this. Celine's smile was devastating. My grandfather controls intelligence networks you can't imagine, she said. Banks, governments, technology infrastructure. When he wants to know something, he knows it. She paused. Get used to having resources you didn't know existed. That's what partnering with a DeLuca means. Damien left the bookstore 20 minutes later, the tablet tucked under his arm, his mind spinning with operational details. Back in his car, he called Roman. I need you to set up a meeting, Damien said. Tomorrow night. Castellano's 3 major partners, Antonio Russo, Michael Chen, and Tommy Delgado. Tell them I have information about a threat to their operations. Urgent, confidential. What kind of threat? Roman asked carefully. The kind that ends empires. Damien stared out at Wicker Park's gentrified streets. I'll explain when you get here. We have work to do. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in manipulation. Roman arranged the meeting for Tuesday night at a private club in River North, neutral territory where Castellano's partners could meet without raising suspicion. Damien spent the day constructing a narrative that would make the financial evidence credible. The story was simple. Damien's organization had been investigating potential partnerships with Castellano's crew. During due diligence, Damien's financial analysts discovered irregularities. Further investigation revealed the offshore accounts and systematic theft. Being a man who valued loyalty and honor among criminals, Damien felt obligated to inform Castellano's partners before they were betrayed. It was a lie built on truth, the kind of deception that worked because 90% of it was verifiable fact. Tuesday evening arrived cold and clear. Damien dressed in a charcoal suit, professional, serious, the kind of thing someone wore when delivering devastating news. Roman drove him to the River North Club, both of them silent during the 30-minute drive. The club was old-school Chicago. Leather booths, dim lighting, paintings of horses and hunting dogs on dark wood walls. A place where men made deals that would never appear in official records. Antonio Russo, Michael Chen, and Tommy Delgado were already waiting in a private room when Damien arrived. 3 men representing 3 different branches of Castellano's criminal enterprise. Russo controlled the construction side, Chen managed the protection rackets. Delgado ran the money laundering operations, all of them dangerous, all of them loyal to Castellano, for now. Moretti, Russo said as Damien entered. He was mid-60s, silver hair, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite. This better be important. I don't drop everything for mysterious meetings. It's important, Damien replied, setting the tablet down on the table between them. Vincent Castellano is stealing from you. The room went very still. That's a serious accusation, Chen said quietly. He was younger than Russo, maybe early 40s, with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years counting other people's money. You have proof? Damien activated the tablet, pulled up the first document. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Shell corporations registered in Delaware and Panama. $8.3 million transferred over the past 3 years. He slid the tablet toward them. All of it skimmed from operations that should have been split evenly between the 4 of you. Delgado, a stocky man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, grabbed the tablet, started scrolling through the documents. His expression went from skeptical to confused to absolutely furious in under 30 seconds. "This son of a bitch," he breathed. "This motherfucking son of a bitch." Russo and Chen crowded around the tablet, reading the evidence, their faces hardening with each transaction record. "How did you get this?" Russo demanded, looking at Damien with suspicion and rage fighting for dominance. "Due diligence," Damien replied smoothly. "My organization was considering a partnership with Castellano's crew. My financial people ran background checks, found irregularities, dug deeper." He paused. "I could have kept this information to myself, used it as leverage, but I believe in honor among our profession. Betrayal like this affects all of us." It was complete bullshit. But it was bullshit wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. Russo stared at the tablet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. "Castellano's been playing us for 3 years," he finally said, "taking money that should have gone to our families, our operations, our people. He's been laughing at you," Damien added quietly. "Every time you split profits, every time you trusted him with operational decisions, he was stealing from you and hiding it in accounts you'd never find." Chen looked up from the tablet, his expression cold as winter. "What do you want out of this, Moretti? Why bring this to us instead of using it yourself?" Damien had prepared for this question. "Because Castellano made a mistake last week," he said. "One of his collectors threatened a business owner in Chinatown, broke the man's hands. That business owner has connections to people I respect." He met Chen's eyes. "I want Castellano gone. His operations absorbed by people who won't terrorize small business owners. I bring you the evidence, you handle the execution, everyone wins except the man who betrayed you." It was close enough to truth, just replacing people I respect with Selene De Luca, that it sounded genuine. Delgado set down the tablet with enough force to make it clatter against the table. "I want him dead," he said flatly. "Tonight, I want to put a bullet in his head myself." "No," Russo said immediately. "We do this smart. Castellano has protection, connections. We move too fast, too sloppy. We start a war we might not win." "Then what?" Delgado demanded. "We call a meeting," Russo replied. "The 4 of us. Tell Castellano we need to discuss expansion opportunities. Get him alone, present the evidence, give him a chance to explain." He smiled without humor. "And when he can't explain, we vote. 3 against 1. His empire gets divided between us, and he disappears." Chen nodded slowly. Clean, efficient, maintains appearances, maintains. They spent the next 30 minutes planning the logistics. Where to meet, when, how to ensure Castellano came alone. Damien offered his waterfront warehouse as neutral territory, secure, private, no witnesses. By the time the meeting ended, Castellano's fate was sealed. Damien left the club feeling something close to nauseous. He'd just orchestrated the execution of a man he'd never personally had conflict with, had manipulated 3 crime bosses into destroying their partner, all on Selene De Luca's orders. In his car, Roman turned to him with an expression Damien couldn't read. "You just became an assassin," his consigliere said quietly. "Maybe not pulling the trigger yourself, but you killed Castellano as surely as if you'd put a gun to his head." "I know. And you did it because a woman you've known for less than a week told you to." "She's not just a woman," Damien replied. "She's dangerous," Roman interrupted. "Powerful. Terrifying. I know, you've said all this." He paused. "But she's also using you, testing you, seeing how far you'll go to prove loyalty. What else am I supposed to do?" "Walk away," Roman said simply. "Take the loss. Rebuild somewhere else. You've got contingency funds, international connections." "Alessandro De Luca would find me," Damien said. "You know he would. There's nowhere I could run that his network wouldn't eventually reach." Roman's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Then you've already chosen death," he said quietly. "Just slower than the alternative." They drove back to Damien's penthouse in silence. 2 days later, Vincent Castellano's body was found in a shipping container at Damien's waterfront warehouse. 3 bullets to the chest, execution style. His 3 former partners released a joint statement claiming Castellano had been embezzling from their shared operations, and the matter had been resolved internally. Nobody questioned it. Nobody investigated. In Chicago's underworld, theft between partners was a death sentence everyone understood. Celine called Damien that evening. "Well done," she said when he answered. "Clean, efficient, no collateral damage. My grandfather is impressed." "Is he?" Damien's voice came out flat. "You sound unhappy." "I just helped murder a man." "You helped remove a violent criminal who terrorized innocent people," Celine corrected. "The Korean restaurant owner sent my grandfather a thank you message. His daughter is grateful. Justice was served." "Justice," Damien repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" Silence on the line for a moment. "You knew what this was when you agreed," Celine finally said. "Don't pretend to have moral qualms now. It's unbecoming." She was right, of course. Damien had known exactly what he was agreeing to, had understood that working with Selena DeLuca meant getting his hands dirty in ways that served her family's interests. He'd just underestimated how quickly it would happen. "What's next?" he asked. "Now?" Celine's voice shifted to something warmer. "Now we celebrate. Dinner tomorrow night. Il Porcellino. 8 o'clock. Dress nicely." She hung up before Damien could respond. The next evening, Damien found himself at one of Chicago's most exclusive Italian restaurants, sitting across from Celine at a corner table that offered privacy from the other diners. She wore a simple black dress, elegant, understated, and looked exactly like a young professional celebrating a successful week, not like someone who just orchestrated a man's execution. They ordered wine, antipasti, fresh pasta that probably cost more per plate than most people spent on groceries for a week. "Tell me about yourself," Celine said after their wine arrived. "The real you, not the crime boss, not the man who runs shipping empires. The person underneath all that." Damien blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Why?" "Because we're going to be working together for a long time," Celine replied. "I'd like to know who I'm working with." So Damien told her. Not everything. Not the violence, not the specifics of criminal operations, but fragments of truth he'd never shared with anyone except Roman. His childhood watching his father build an empire through brutality. His mother's death when he was 16. The way he'd taken over the organization at 22 and systematically eliminated every rival who'd thought him too young, too inexperienced. The loneliness of power. The way ruling through fear meant never having anyone you could actually trust. Celine listened without interrupting, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're lonely," she finally said. "I'm powerful. Those aren't mutually exclusive." Celine sipped her wine. "My grandfather is the most powerful man I know. He's also the loneliest. He has subordinates, enforcers, business partners, but he has no friends. No one he can speak to honestly without calculating how they might use the information." "Is that why you run a bookstore?" Damien asked. "To escape that kind of isolation?" Celine smiled. "Partially. Also because I genuinely love books. And because pretending to be normal is the closest I'll ever come to actually being normal." They talked through dinner, not about operations or intelligence or criminal enterprises, but about literature and music and the architecture of Chicago. Celine spoke 5 languages fluently and had spent years studying art history in Florence. She quoted philosophers and poets with the ease of someone who'd been educated in ways that had nothing to do with violence. She was, Damien realized with uncomfortable clarity, the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Beautiful and brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with armed enforcers. By the time dessert arrived, Damien felt something shifting in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Not attraction exactly, more like recognition, the sense of meeting someone who understood what it meant to wear masks, to build walls, to live in a world where trust was currency and vulnerability was suicide. "I have a question," Damien said as they finished tiramisu that tasted like clouds. "Ask." "Why me? Alessandro has hundreds of men loyal to him. Why trust a relative stranger, someone who humiliated you publicly, with protecting you in Chicago?" Celine set down her fork, studied him with those evaluating eyes. "Because my grandfather believes in redemption," she said quietly. "Not forgiveness, he never forgives, but redemption. The idea that people can learn from mistakes if the consequences are severe enough." She paused. "You made a mistake. You faced consequences. You learned. That makes you more trustworthy than someone who's never been tested. And what do you believe? Celine smiled. I believe people are exactly who they show themselves to be under pressure, she said. When you thought I was powerless, you were cruel. When you discovered who I actually was, you adapted. When my grandfather threatened you, you submitted intelligently instead of fighting stupidly. She leaned forward slightly. You're a survivor, Damien. Survivors are useful. The check arrived. Damien reached for it automatically, but Celine's hand covered his. My treat, she said. Consider it payment for services rendered. Outside the restaurant, Chicago's November wind cut through Damien's coat like a blade. His car waited at the curb, Roman behind the wheel. Selena's security, 2 men in a black SUV, idled behind them. Thank you for dinner, Damien said. Thank you for Castellano. Selene's smile was genuine. My grandfather was impressed. So was I. She stepped closer, close enough that Damien could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive, and rose up on her toes to kiss his cheek. Her lips were warm against his skin. Good night, Damien, she murmured. Then she turned and walked to her SUV, disappearing into the back seat before Damien's brain could catch up to what had just happened. He stood on the sidewalk like an idiot, hand unconsciously touching the place where she'd kissed him, until Roman honked the horn. In the car, his consigliere gave him a look. Don't, Roman said. Don't what? Don't fall for her. She's using you, testing you, playing games you don't understand. I'm not falling for anyone. You're a terrible liar, Roman replied. Always have been. Damien turned to look out the window, watching Chicago slide past in the darkness, and tried to convince himself that Roman was wrong, that the warmth spreading through his chest was strategic appreciation, not something more dangerous, that he hadn't just started falling for the most terrifying woman he'd ever met. But Damien Moretti had never been good at lying to himself, and as the car carried him home through Chicago's glittering streets, he realized the most dangerous game had just begun. Not between empires, between hearts that had both forgotten how to be vulnerable. And in a world where vulnerability was weakness, that was the most terrifying risk of all. 3 weeks passed before Damien understood that falling in love with Celine DeLuca wasn't a choice he'd made. It was a trap he'd walked into with eyes wide open. December arrived in Chicago with the kind of bitter cold that made your bones ache. Snow fell in sheets across the city, turning the skyline into something out of a postcard while making the streets treacherous and mean. Damien's shipping operations slowed to a crawl as ice locked up the ports. His political connections went quiet as the city government focused on snow removal budgets and winter logistics. But his partnership with Celine intensified. She'd call at random hours with requests that sounded simple but carried layers of complexity. Help move a shipment through customs without inspection. Provide security for a meeting between East Coast families who didn't trust each other. Gather intelligence on a federal prosecutor who was getting too close to one of Alessandro's subsidiaries. Each task was a test. Each success brought them closer. And somewhere between the operational planning and the late-night phone calls and the dinners that started as business and ended as something else entirely, Damien stopped pretending he was just following orders. He was falling, hard and fast and completely, for a woman who could destroy him with a phone call. Roman noticed, of course. His consigliere had been watching Damien with increasing concern as the partnership with Celine deepened. They were in Damien's penthouse office on a Thursday evening, reviewing shipping manifests, when Roman finally said what he'd been holding back for weeks. You're in love with her. Damien looked up from the computer screen where he'd been analyzing port schedules. What? Celine DeLuca. Roman set down the file he'd been reading. You're in love with her, and it's going to get you killed. I'm not. Don't insult my intelligence, Roman interrupted. I've known you for 15 years. I watched you build an empire on calculated ruthlessness. I've never seen you care about anyone or anything except power and survival. He paused. Until her. Damien wanted to argue, wanted to deny it with the same casual dismissal he'd use for any other accusation. But Roman deserved better than lies. Maybe, Damien admitted quietly. Maybe, Roman's voice rose. You just orchestrated the execution of a man you'd never met because she asked you to. You've restructured your entire operation to serve her family's interests. You spend every free moment either working for her or thinking about her. He stood, paced to the windows overlooking the frozen lake. That's not maybe, Damien. That's all the way gone. So what if I am? Damien pushed back from his desk. What exactly am I supposed to do about it? Walk away? Pretend I don't feel what I feel? Yes, Roman said flatly, because feelings are weaknesses in this world. And Selena DeLuca is the kind of woman who will use your weakness to control you completely. She's not like that. Roman laughed, bitter and exhausted. She's exactly like that. She's Alessandro DeLuca's heir, trained from childhood to manipulate, to control, to win at any cost. He turned to face Damien. The bookstore, the modest apartment, the whole I just want something normal act. It's all theater designed to make you think she's vulnerable when she's actually the most dangerous person in Chicago. You don't know her. Neither do you, Roman shot back. You know what she's shown you, the version of herself she wants you to see. But you don't know what she's really thinking, what she's really planning, whether any of this is real or just another test. The words hit harder than they should have because part of Damien wondered the same thing. Was Celine genuinely interested in him, or was this all elaborate manipulation designed to ensure his complete loyalty? I have to believe it's real, Damien said quietly. Because if it's not, then I've already lost everything that matters. Roman's expression softened into something that looked almost like pity. Then you'd better hope she feels the same way, he said. Because if she doesn't, you're going to destroy yourself trying to earn something she'll never give. That conversation haunted Damien for the next 48 hours. He went through the motions of running his empire, approved shipments, managed personnel, handled the 1,000 small crises that came with controlling criminal infrastructure, but his mind kept circling back to Roman's words. Was Celine using him, testing him, playing games he didn't understand, or was the connection between them as real as it felt? On Saturday evening, Celine called. I need to see you, she said without preamble. Tonight, my apartment, 9 o'clock. Her voice sounded different, strained, almost fragile. What's wrong? Damien asked immediately. Just come, please. She hung up before he could respond. Damien arrived at Celine's Wicker Park apartment at 8:55, his mind racing through possibilities. Threat assessment, federal investigation, something from her grandfather. 1,000 scenarios, none of them good. The building's security recognized him now, nodded him through without question. He took the stairs 2 at a time, reached the 4th floor breathing harder than he should have been, and knocked on apartment 4C. The door opened. Celine stood in the doorway wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair down around her shoulders. No makeup, eyes red like she'd been crying. Damien had never seen her look so human, so breakable. Come in, she said quietly. The apartment was dark except for a single lamp near the couch. Classical music played softly, the same orchestral piece from the first time Damien had been here. A bottle of wine sat open on the coffee table next to 2 glasses. Sit, Celine said, gesturing to the couch. Damien sat. Celine poured wine for both of them with hands that trembled slightly, then curled up on the opposite end of the couch, pulling her knees to her chest like someone trying to make herself smaller. My grandfather called today, she said. Damien's stomach dropped. And? He wants me to come back to New York. Celine's voice was barely above a whisper. Permanently. He says Chicago is too dangerous, too exposed, that I've proven I can handle operations, but now it's time to take my place in the family business. In New York, where he can protect me properly. What did you tell him? I told him I needed time to think. Celine took a long drink of wine, which is code for I don't want to go, but I don't know how to refuse. Damien set down his own glass, his mind working through implications. If Celine left Chicago, their partnership ended. The protection agreement, the intelligence sharing, everything they'd built over the past month, everything he'd started to feel. Do you want to go? He asked. Celine looked at him with eyes that held something Damien had never seen before. Fear. Genuine, unfiltered fear. No, she said. I love Chicago. I love my bookstore. I love having something that's mine, something that isn't about empires and violence and family legacy. She paused. But my grandfather isn't asking. He's telling. And when Alessandro DeLuca tells you to do something, you do it. Even if it makes you miserable? Especially then. Celine's smile was sad. That's what duty means in my family. Sacrifice. Obedience. Putting the organization above everything else. Damien thought about his own father. The way the old man had demanded absolute loyalty, absolute submission. The way love and approval had always been conditional on usefulness. Fuck duty, he said. Celine blinked. What? Fuck duty, Damien repeated, louder this time. Fuck family obligation and legacy and all the bullshit about sacrifice. You're not a piece on your grandfather's chessboard. You're a person. You deserve to make your own choices. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Damien moved closer on the couch, close enough that their knees almost touched. You told me once that I only respected you when I was afraid of you. That when I thought you were powerless, I treated you like trash. He met her eyes. Don't let your grandfather do the same thing. Don't let him treat you like you're powerless to choose your own life. Celine stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. You think I should refuse him, she said quietly. I think you should tell him the truth, that you're happy here, that you're building something real, that you'll serve the family from Chicago instead of New York. And if he says no, then you make him understand that you're not asking permission. Damien's voice was firm. You're Alessandro De Luca's heir, the most dangerous woman in Chicago. You don't beg, you negotiate. Celine's eyes were shining now, tears threatening to spill over. He could disown me, she whispered. Cut me off completely. I'd lose everything. Would you? Damien asked. You'd lose access to his empire, his resources, his protection, but you'd keep yourself, your choices, your life. He paused. That's not nothing. A single tear tracked down Celine's cheek, then another. Damien had watched this woman order a man's execution without blinking, had seen her dismantle rivals with surgical precision, had witnessed her command armed enforcers like pieces on a board, but he'd never seen her cry. I'm terrified, she admitted, of disappointing him, of failing, of proving I'm not strong enough to be a De Luca. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Damien said. Strength isn't about following orders. It's about knowing when to refuse them. Celine set down her wine glass with trembling hands, then moved across the couch and buried her face against Damien's chest. He wrapped his arms around her instinctively, feeling her shake with silent tears, and realized this was the real Celine. Not the composed bookstore clerk, not the terrifying heir, just a young woman carrying impossible weight on shoulders that had never been given permission to be weak. They stayed like that for a long time, Celine crying quietly while Damien held her, the classical music playing softly, Chicago's winter wind rattling the windows. Eventually, the tears stopped. Celine pulled back slightly, her face blotchy and red and more beautiful than Damien had ever seen it. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Stand up to him. Choose myself. I've spent my entire life being what he needed me to be. Then learn, Damien said. I'll help you. We'll figure it out together. Celine looked at him with an expression that made Damien's heart hammer against his ribs. Why? She asked. Why would you risk everything to help me defy the most powerful crime lord in America? Damien could have lied, could have said it was strategic, that keeping her in Chicago served his interests. But he was tired of lying, especially to himself. Because I'm in love with you, he said. The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. Celine's breath caught. Damien, I know it's insane, he continued. I know you could be using me, testing me, playing games I don't understand. I know falling in love with you is probably the stupidest thing I've ever done. He paused. But I don't care, because the past month with you has been the first time in my entire life I've felt like more than just a collection of power plays and strategic calculations. You make me want to be better, different, real. Celine stared at him with wide eyes. Say something, Damien said when the silence stretched too long. Instead of speaking, Celine leaned forward and kissed him. Her lips were soft and warm and tasted like wine and salt from tears. Damien's brain short-circuited for approximately 3 seconds before he kissed her back, his hands coming up to cup her face, feeling her lean into him like someone who'd been holding themselves together by force of will and finally had permission to fall apart. The kiss deepened, became desperate, became everything neither of them had known they needed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. Celine's eyes were clear, determined. "I'm staying in Chicago," she said. "Are you sure?" "No." Celine's smile was shaky but genuine. "But I'm going to do it anyway, because you're right. I deserve to choose my own life, even if it terrifies me." She pulled out her phone, stared at it for a long moment, then dialed. The call connected after 2 rings. "Grandfather," Celine said, her voice steady despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. "I've made my decision about New York." Damien couldn't hear Alessandro's response, but he watched Celine's expression shift from nervous to determined. "I'm staying in Chicago," she continued. "I'm happy here. I'm building something real. And I can serve the family just as effectively from here as I could from New York." She paused. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I've decided." Silence on the other end. Celine's hand tightened around the phone. "I understand that disappoints you," she said quietly, "but I'm your heir. Eventually, I'll lead this family. And I can't do that if I've never learned to make my own decisions." More silence. Then Celine's expression shifted to something between relief and disbelief. "Thank you, grandfather," she said. "I won't let you down." She ended the call and stared at the phone like it might explode. "What did he say?" Damien asked. "He said..." Celine's voice cracked slightly. "He said my father would be proud of me, for choosing my own path, for being strong enough to refuse him." A laugh bubbled out of her, half sob, half genuine amusement. "He's been waiting for this," she continued, "waiting to see if I'd ever stand up to him. It was another test, and I almost failed by being too afraid to try." Damien pulled her close again, felt her arms wrap around him, and realized that everything had just changed. Alessandro De Luca had given his blessing. Celine was staying in Chicago. And Damien had just admitted he was in love with the most dangerous woman he'd ever met. The next 3 months passed in a blur of operational efficiency and emotional intensity that Damien had never experienced before. He and Celine became partners in every sense of the word. She moved some of her intelligence operations into his infrastructure. He provided security for De Luca meetings in the Midwest. They shared information, coordinated strategies, built something that looked like an actual alliance instead of subordination. But more than that, they built something personal. Dinners that turned into conversations that stretched past midnight. Weekend mornings at her bookstore, where Damien learned to appreciate poetry he'd always dismissed as pretentious. Quiet evenings in his penthouse, where Celine taught him to cook actual food instead of ordering takeout. They fought, of course. Vicious arguments about operational decisions and trust and the fundamental differences between how they'd been raised. Celine's calm strategic thinking clashing with Damien's impulsive aggression, his need for control battling her refusal to be controlled. But they also learned. Damien learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that admitting fear didn't make you powerless, that love was actually stronger than fear if you were brave enough to let it be. Celine learned that not everyone in the world would use her openness against her, that being herself, the real self underneath all the masks, was possible with someone who actually saw her. Roman remained skeptical, but gradually came around as he watched Damien become something he'd never been before. Happy. Actually, genuinely happy. "I still think you're both insane," Roman said one evening in early March as they reviewed quarterly numbers. "But I've never seen you like this, balanced, stable, like you're actually living instead of just surviving." "She makes me want to be better," Damien replied simply. "Then don't fuck it up," Roman said, "because if you lose her, you'll never find this again." Damien had no intention of losing her, which made what happened next feel like the universe laughing at his arrogance. The crisis started with a phone call from one of Damien's port contacts on a Wednesday afternoon in late March. Federal agents had raided 3 of his warehouses simultaneously, seized shipping manifests, arrested 4 of his logistics managers, were currently building a RICO case that could dismantle his entire organization. Someone had talked. Someone inside his operation had turned informant. Damien spent the next 72 hours in controlled panic, working with Roman to identify the leak, contain the damage, and figure out how badly they were exposed. Celine helped, using De Luca intelligence resources to identify which federal prosecutor was leading the investigation and what evidence they'd actually gathered. The answer was worse than Damien had feared. They had everything. Shipping routes, financial records, communications showing clear knowledge of smuggling operations, testimony from the informant detailing years of criminal activity. Damien was facing 20 years minimum if indicted, possibly life. On Saturday evening, he sat in his penthouse with Celine and Roman, staring at the evidence laid out across his desk, and tried to figure out how to avoid spending the rest of his life in federal prison. "You could run," Roman said. "I've got contingency plans. Fake passports, offshore accounts, contacts in countries without extradition treaties. Running means abandoning everything," Damien interrupted. "The organization, Chicago, everything I've built." "Better than prison," Roman replied. "Is it?" Damien looked at Celine, who'd been quiet through the entire discussion. "What do you think?" Celine's expression was carefully neutral. "I think you have a third option," she said quietly. "Which is?" "You make the case disappear." Damien blinked. "How exactly would I do that?" Celine stood, walked to the windows overlooking the lake, her silhouette backlit by city lights. "My grandfather controls federal judges," she said. "Prosecutors, FBI agents. People embedded so deep in the justice system that they've been assets for decades." She turned to face him. "He could make this investigation vanish, bury the evidence, discredit the informant, have the whole thing dismissed as insufficient basis for prosecution." Hope flared in Damien's chest before reality crushed it. "At what cost?" he asked. Celine's smile was sad. "Complete subordination," she said. "You'd owe my grandfather a debt you could never repay. He'd own you, your organization, everything. You'd spend the rest of your life working for the DeLuca family with zero autonomy." The room went silent. "Or," Celine continued, "you could refuse, take your chances with the federal case, maybe win, maybe lose. But either way, you'd still be yourself." Damien looked at this woman he'd fallen in love with and saw genuine pain in her eyes. She didn't want to make this offer, didn't want him to accept it, but she'd made it anyway because she loved him enough to give him the choice. "If I accept," Damien said slowly, "what happens to us?" Celine's expression cracked slightly. "I don't know," she admitted. "My grandfather would expect complete loyalty, no divided attention, no personal relationships that might compromise operational efficiency." She paused. "We'd probably have to end this, go back to just being allies. Maybe not even that." "And if I refuse? If I take my chances with the case?" "Then I'll help you fight it," Celine said immediately. "Whatever resources I have, whatever intelligence I can gather, we'll battle this together. Even if we lose, even then." Damien stood, walked to where she stood by the windows, and took her hands in his. "I spent 32 years building power because I thought it was the only thing that mattered," he said. "I humiliated people, destroyed lives, became exactly the kind of monster I once hated." He squeezed her hands gently. "And then I met you. And you showed me that being powerful doesn't mean being cruel, that strength can coexist with kindness, that vulnerability isn't weakness if you're brave enough to trust someone." Tears were forming in Celine's eyes again. "I'm not trading my soul for survival," Damien continued. "Not again. If I go to prison, at least I'll go as myself, as someone who chose love over fear, as someone who finally learned what actually matters." A sob broke from Celine's throat. "You're sure?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything." She kissed him then, desperate and fierce and tasting like salt, while Chicago glittered beyond the windows and Damien's entire empire balanced on the edge of collapse. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the empire. He cared about the woman in his arms. And that made all the difference. The federal case took 8 months to go to trial. 8 months of legal maneuvering, evidence suppression motions, witness testimony. Celine used every DeLuca resource that didn't compromise Damien's independence. Intelligence on the prosecutors, background on the informant, strategic advice from lawyers who'd spent decades defending organized crime figures. Roman coordinated the legal defense while maintaining what was left of Damien's shipping operation, and Damien prepared himself for the possibility that he might spend the next 20 years in prison. The trial was brutal. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of smuggling, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. The informant, a former logistics manager named Eddie Sullivan, testified for 6 days about specific shipments, specific conversations, specific criminal activities. It looked hopeless. But Celine had found something the prosecution had missed. Eddie Sullivan had been skimming money from Damien's operations for years, had hidden accounts, falsified records, stolen approximately $2 million that he'd then used to buy a house, a boat, and a second family the first family didn't know about. The defense destroyed him on cross-examination, presented evidence that Sullivan had lied about dozens of shipments because he'd been stealing from them, demonstrated that his testimony was motivated by revenge after Damien discovered the theft, made him look like exactly what he was, a criminal trying to trade lies for a reduced sentence. The jury deliberated for 43 hours. Damien sat in the courtroom with Celine on one side and Roman on the other, trying not to think about spending the rest of his life in a cage. When the jury returned, the forewoman looked exhausted. "On the count of racketeering," she said, "we find the defendant not guilty." Damien's heart stopped. "On the count of conspiracy to commit money laundering, we find the defendant not guilty." Roman grabbed his arm. "On the count of smuggling contraband, we find the defendant not guilty." Celine's hand found his under the table, squeezed tight. Not guilty on all 17 counts. Complete acquittal. The courtroom exploded into chaos. The prosecution looked devastated. The defense team was celebrating. And Damien sat frozen, unable to process that he'd just won, that he was free. Outside the courthouse, press swarmed them with cameras and questions. Damien gave a brief statement thanking the jury for their service and maintaining his innocence, then climbed into a waiting car with Celine and Roman. Nobody spoke during the drive back to Damien's penthouse. There was too much to process, too much emotion. When they finally reached his apartment, Roman excused himself with a knowing look, leaving Damien and Celine alone. They stood in the living room as the sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. "You won," Celine said quietly. "We won," Damien corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you. You could have avoided the whole thing if you'd accepted my grandfather's offer and lost everything that matters." Damien turned to face her. "I don't regret it, not for a second." Celine's eyes shone with tears. "I love you," she said. "I've been terrified to say it because I didn't want to make this harder. But I love you. Completely, recklessly, in ways that probably make me a terrible heir to a criminal empire." Damien pulled her close, felt her melt against him. "I love you too," he said. "And I don't care if it makes us terrible criminals. We'll figure it out, together." They stood there as the sun disappeared and Chicago's lights began to glow. Two people who'd found something neither had been looking for. Not power, not fear, not the empire they'd been born to inherit, but something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more valuable: each other. 6 months later, Damien stood in Celine's bookstore on a Saturday afternoon, watching her help a customer find a first edition of their favorite novel. She wore jeans and that same oversized cardigan, her hair in a messy bun, completely absorbed in the simple joy of connecting someone with a book they'd love. This was who she really was. Not Alessandro De Luca's terrifying heir. Not the woman who'd ordered Marco Viscari dragged away screaming, just Celine. A woman who loved books and classical music and Chicago winters. A woman who'd chosen to build a real life instead of just inheriting one. Damien's empire had been restructured after the trial. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations, letting Roman handle the logistics while he focused on legitimate business interests. The shipping company was slowly going clean. Would take years, probably decades, but the transformation had started. He and Celine had bought a house together in Lincoln Park. Nothing ostentatious, just a converted brownstone with a library and a garden and space for the life they were building. Alessandro had visited once shortly after they'd moved in, had dinner with them, inspected the house, and given his blessing in that quiet way that meant more than words. "My son would have liked you," he'd told Damien before leaving. "You remind me of him. Someone who chose love over legacy." It was the highest compliment Alessandro De Luca had ever given. Now, watching Celine laugh with a customer about some obscure poet, Damien felt something he'd never expected to feel. Contentment. Not the restless hunger for power that had driven him for 32 years, not the cold satisfaction of defeating rivals. Just simple, genuine contentment with the life he was living. Celine looked up, caught him staring, and smiled. That smile made everything worth it. Every humiliation, every threat, every moment of terror when he'd thought he might lose her. All of it had led here. To this moment, to this life, to this woman who'd transformed him from a vicious crime boss into someone who understood what actually mattered. The bell above the bookstore door chimed. A young woman entered, looking nervous, clutching a piece of paper. Celine greeted her warmly, guided her toward the poetry section. And Damien watched the woman he loved do what she did best. Make people feel seen, make them feel valued, make them feel like they mattered. It was the opposite of everything Damien had been taught about power, but it was infinitely more effective. Because Celine didn't rule through fear, she ruled through connection, through genuine care, through the radical act of treating people like human beings instead of pieces on a board. And somewhere in the process of loving her, Damien had learned to do the same. He wasn't perfect, still made mistakes, still had moments where his old instincts surfaced, the calculation, the coldness, the willingness to hurt others to protect himself. But Celine was there to remind him, to pull him back, to show him that he could be better, that he was better, that the man who'd called her trash no longer existed. He'd been burned away in the fire of consequence and rebuilt into something new, something that looked remarkably like redemption. As winter darkness fell across Chicago and the bookstore's warm light glowed against the cold, Damien made himself a promise. He would spend the rest of his life earning the second chance she'd given him, would prove every day that love was stronger than fear, that vulnerability was braver than violence, that the most powerful thing a person could do was choose to be kind when the world expected cruelty. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, moments when the old life tried to pull him back, but he wouldn't face them alone. He'd face them with Celine, the woman who'd seen him at his worst and loved him anyway. The woman who'd taught him that standing in gasoline wasn't a threat if you were strong enough to put the match away. The woman who'd transformed his empire of fear into something that looked remarkably like hope. And as Celine caught his eye across the bookstore and smiled, that genuine warm smile that she'd finally learned to give freely, Damien smiled back. Not the cold smile of a predator, not the calculated smile of a strategist, just the smile of a man who'd finally found home, in the most unexpected place, in the last person he'd ever thought would matter. In the woman who'd shown him that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't power or violence or criminal empires. It was the courage to be vulnerable with someone who deserved your trust. And Damien Moretti had finally found that courage, which meant he'd finally found everything.